This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1014 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by DraftKings. Thanks for tuning in. I've teamed up with DraftKings to kick off Week 1. Head over to DraftKings, deposit $5, and get rewarded with one DFS ticket for Week 1. And play free for your shot at a share of millions. The ticket reward amount varies and is based on deposit, but make sure you sign up with promo code LATEROUND today. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 8778-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY to 467-369 in New York. Help is available from Problem Gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. 18 plus in most eligible states, but age varies by jurisdiction. Eligibility restrictions apply. Void where prohibited. One per customer. Minimum $5 deposit required. Ticket rewards are site credits only valid for use on eligible DFS contests. Ticket rewards are single use and expire 9/8/25 at 8:20 p.m. Eastern. See terms at DraftKings.com/promotions. Sponsored by DraftKings. It's a mailbag episode. Let's get to it. The first question this week is from Jamie on Patreon. It says, what are the biggest questions you're hoping to find answers to in Week 1? Backfields are always the most interesting thing to watch, for me at least, in Week 1. Because as I always say, the way backfields are split just comes down to a coaching decision. And we don't exactly know how coaches are thinking this time of year throughout the offseason. Whereas at wide receiver, talent can find its way to targets because multiple wide receivers are on the field at once. Typically, we only have one running back. So I'm really interested to see certain backfield splits. I think the Jets are interesting given what we've heard about Braylon Allen over the last couple of months. I'm interested to see how Pittsburgh in that same game, how they deploy their backfield. Jacksonville's going to be interesting. Even Houston. There are a ton of backfields that I'm interested in seeing this week. And then there's obviously rookies. I'm always curious to see how those rookies look in Week 1. It's hard to answer this with just one or two specific things. All summer long, we're trying to answer hundreds of questions. But some of those answers, they will be revealed here in Week 1. And I can't wait. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @Ben_Cumberledge. It says, you had Rodriguez as a buy candidate on this week's 15 transactions episode. How does the McNichols being listed as the RB2 on the depth chart impact your outlook on the Commanders' backfield in the short and long term? Assuming that it has any bearing for you. So just to be clear, he's not a buy, he's an add, which is very different. I know this seems like semantics, but it's actually not. One is free or it costs a roster spot, while the other, you're trading away a valuable asset to get that player. And I don't think we're there right now with Chris Rodriguez. But I got literally 10 plus questions this week about depth charts. Not even an exaggeration. You can head to the Patreon and just look at the mailbag thread. There are multiple questions about these depth charts. And I'm here to tell you, they don't matter. I don't care whatsoever about depth charts. I care 0% about them. Maybe like 1 or 2%. But there is no chance that Travion Henderson, as long as he's healthy, will be the number 3 running back in New England this year. That Antonio Gibson will see more touches than Travion Henderson. If that happens, then the Patriots are the most inept organization on planet Earth. Now, maybe you want to use depth charts as a high-level understanding of how a team is going to deploy a player. Like sometimes you'll see guys listed as a slot wide receiver. That's not nothing. But we generally already know that information anyway. I don't think we're about to see Jeremy McNichols see the second most touches in the Washington backfield. Instead of relying on the depth chart, just rely on the information that you know about these players. McNichols is more of a backup to Eckler given how he's been deployed in the past. Chris Rodriguez and Bill Krosky-Merritt, those two are going to battle for more early down work. Ignore depth charts, go with your own talent evaluation. That's the message here. This next question is from Twitter. It's from @GudgeTugman. It says, can you talk about how to approach drafting ambiguous backfield situations? Do one of ADP, age, or projected role, early down versus third down back, hold higher importance? Do you ever draft both backs in those backfields? So I actually had a few questions about this one too, so let's get into it. As you guys know, I've been talking about ambiguous backfields for years. Long ago, I realized that the running backs who emerge most frequently in fantasy football, they come from more up in the air situations. They're not usually just straight handcuffs. They don't usually have like top 12, top 18 running backs in their backfield. They're usually in these backfields where we have no idea who the starter is. And the reason they're valuable is because a player can emerge from those backfields. And when they do, they become huge draft day values because their costs were down. Fantasy managers will push them down draft boards because these managers say to themselves, I don't know who the best player in this backfield actually is. I'm not going to draft him because I don't know how much work he's going to see. Now, something that gets asked pretty frequently, and it's asked in this question, is about stacking ambiguous backfields. Why not just draft the entire Jacksonville backfield this year? Because then you know that you're capturing the player who ends up emerging. Well, that's exactly the problem. Most ambiguous backfields don't have a running back who emerges. It doesn't make them bad bets. It doesn't mean that you should avoid those backfields because they're still the type of environment that you want to target versus the alternative. It's just that we don't see like loads and loads of league-winning running backs every year. So the odds that you've picked the exact right backfield are pretty slim. So I would much rather throw darts at multiple backfields in order to improve my chances of finding the backfield that ends up producing a super relevant running back. And I can increase my odds in finding who that player is or which one to target by just looking at the other average draft position trends and archetype trends that I talk about in the late round draft guide. You typically want younger players. It doesn't mean you simply just get the youngest guy in one of these ambiguous backfields. And actually, certain ages like year 2 running backs, they've been better than rookies in the middle rounds over the last 10 or so years. But I'm typically not going to buy into like a 29, 30-year-old running back at a high clip. However, I will lean into those players if they have a good pass-catching backbone. Like with Minnesota this offseason, I felt better about Aaron Jones than Jordan Mason, despite Mason being the younger back. And that has to do with the fact that Jones is a really good pass catcher. Jordan Mason, he has a lot of question marks there. Now, I totally get the upside of Mason. I think there's a chance that he sees more work on the ground than Aaron Jones this year. But pass catching is the key that unlocks fantasy upside at running back. I leaned into Jaylen Warren over Caleb Johnson for the exact same reasons. I didn't fade Mason or Johnson, but I preferred the pass catching back, or the player we think is going to catch more passes, because we have loads of data suggesting that that's the route that we should go in. But like in the end, I'm looking at what we know versus what we don't know. I'll often lean into uncertainty when looking at which running back to target. Like I've preferred Bashaw Tutin at cost over the other 2 running backs in Jacksonville this offseason, because I do think he has the most upside. But look, me being into Bashaw Tutin doesn't mean that I'm totally fading Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby. Now, I know some of you only play in 1 or 2 leagues, and you have to make that choice. And if I had to make that choice, I would say I would just get Bashaw Tutin and not those 2 other backs. But when you're in a lot of leagues or you're giving a lot of advice like I do, I'm doing like 6 podcast episodes a week. I want to be open-minded and explain to you guys how I actually feel about these situations. And how I feel is that, yes, I like Tutin most, but I don't think Travis Etienne or Tank Bigsby are zeros at all. They're part of a very attractive ambiguous backfield. I just have preferences. And that was Tutin out of that one just because he was a good prospect. He's got a 3-down skill set. And it's not like Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby are currently can't-miss players. But those are the things that go through my mind when looking at these ambiguous backfields. There's not like a formula that you just overlay on them. Nothing is like that in fantasy football. There's no golden key that unlocks everything. That's just not how this game works. There's tons of nuance. But we do have to stay grounded with what we know. And what we know, first and foremost, is that pass catching is really, really important and still undervalued at the running back position. The next question is from Clay on Patreon. It says, I am an underdog in week 1. Trevor Lawrence is my quarterback, and I need to find a tight end off waivers. Is it optimal to stack Lawrence and Brenton Strange, or should I go with Chigakonkwo, who you have ranked higher? So look, I don't do start-sit questions for the mailbag episode because it would get incredibly obnoxious and really boring for people who listen to this show. And this does seem like a start-sit question, but it's not. It's a process question. First, just know that with any lower-end tight end decisions, you're really asking a question that has tons and tons of variance. Any fantasy analyst who says that a decision between Brenton Strange and Chigakonkwo is obvious, or like 90% one way or the other, they're a bad fantasy analyst. There's too much variance with lower end players, let alone lower end players in week 1 where we have such little information. There's too much variance to be that confident. But I also want to answer this question because 99.9% of you play on sites where there's a projection for your matchup. And that projection, it might influence how you approach your lineup decisions. Unless it's glaringly obvious, unless you're facing just a monster of a team and your team sucks, you don't need to force a suboptimal play in order to add variance to your team. Like this tight end question, there's enough variance to where I could easily go either direction. I mean, let's just be honest here. If you want to stack Trevor Lawrence because you want higher upside in your lineup, I don't think that's a bad process call at all. I'm talking like avoiding certain quarterbacks in your lineup because your opponent has their pass catchers, and then you being suboptimal as a result. You're overthinking a 50-50 game. Fantasy football is a 50-50 game. You're playing one opponent. You don't need to treat it like a tournament. So without knowing the matchup, I can't tell you what's optimal. What I can tell you is that in week 1, it's important to not be overconfident in your decisions because we just don't have that much information. And the people building the projections on all those platforms, they don't have that information either. This last question is from Trevor on Patreon. It says, "Hi JJ, thanks for all the help through another draft season. I feel great following the advice chasing ceiling in the later rounds, taking players like rookies or ambiguous backfield running backs who could pay off later in the season. Awesome. But week 1, some undrafted players are going to pop off, and they could potentially be league winners as well. Do you have any guidance on deciding between drafted players with potential late breakouts versus undrafted players who show out early? What's the balance between being patient versus holding on to your priors too long?" So I kind of spoke about this last week, but I think I can get a little bit more detailed here. I think you have to remember that in fantasy football, you don't need to exactly predict the insane breakout. You just need to like a player a little bit more than the rest of your league mates. A good and easy go-to with this is with Puka Nacua. Now, Nacua was a late round dart throw in the draft guide during his rookie season. Before he did anything, I had him as a late round dart throw. He then went out in week 1 and he dominated. Like he absolutely crushed. I remember vividly talking on this podcast and telling people to be aggressive in getting him if he was still on the waiver wire. Now, I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back. I get things right, I get things wrong. That just happened to be one of the best calls of my career. I'm saying this because there were so many layers to that transaction. And it's just a really, really good example. First, with Nacua, there was a backbone. When a player goes off in week 1 or early on in the season, and it was seriously out of nowhere, that's somewhat of a red flag. Nacua was kind of out of nowhere, but it also kind of wasn't. There was a reason he was a dart throw in the draft guide that year. There was a lot of hype surrounding him out of Rams camp. He was an interesting prospect. Nakua's week 1 performance as a rookie wasn't anything like Kevin Ogletree in week 1 of the 2012 season. Some of you might not even know who Kevin Ogletree is. But that year, he came out for Dallas. He went 8 for 114 and 2 touchdowns in the first game of the season. He scored 2 more times through the rest of the year, and he got to 50 yards just twice. Ogletree at that time was a 4-year player in the NFL. He'd done nothing like that before. There was no reason to blindly buy into this idea that he was going to be a star. For Puka Nacua, it was his first NFL game. And his peripherals were awesome. The answer I gave last week on what to watch out for was usage. You don't want to buy into a player who just had good production. You need that production to be backed by good usage too, good peripherals. Now, sometimes production can lead to better usage, but when it's the total package, that's when you know that you can kind of go all in. And like I said at the start of this answer, you don't need to exactly predict the breakout. We need to get that idea out of our heads. There's this idea out there that data people, they can't at all predict outliers. Guess what? Neither can a regular person who's just watching film. No one can predict outliers. They're outliers for a reason. That's exactly what outlier means. They're unpredictable. But you can still obtain that outlier by simply liking a player a little bit more than the rest of your league mates do. Never in a million years did I think Puka Nacua was going to be this good. Neither did anyone else on planet Earth. Maybe aside from Nacua and his family. But I didn't need to predict that in order to win Nacua off the waiver wire or to draft him. Like the same thing is going on right now in our drafts in the late round dart throws that we threw, right? I drafted Torrey Horton. I like Torrey Horton. I like Bashal Tutin. The odds that those players become fantasy football superstars, the odds are slim. They're very slim. And I'm recognizing that right now. If Torrey Horton and Bashal Tutin end up being amazing fantasy assets, I am not predicting that to happen. I just like their odds more than the players who are being drafted around them. And I like their odds of being good more than my league mates do. That's the difference. No one needs to predict the outlier. And it's so important to wrap your head around that concept. So it's mixing all that kind of analysis and doing the same thing with players on your own roster, right? When you're thinking about adding or dropping a player. Dropping players is not easy. You're going to regret some of your drops. That's fantasy football. But if you're rational, if you're logical, and you're doing things with a sound process, you'll make good moves far more often than bad ones. And think about a player's backbone, who he is as a player, his journey in the league, how he was deployed during that breakout. It's going to help you make a better decision with your roster. I guarantee it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky, at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. There's a Late Round Perspectives episode that's going to hit the podcast feed later today. And then tomorrow, you'll hear the audio version of the Late Round Fantasy Football show. Thanks for listening. Greatly appreciate it. Enjoy football this weekend.